My boyfriend and I love camping. It's our escape from the endless grind of university life. 2 weeks ago, we planned a weekend adventure along the coast. It was a rare treat. We had a Friday off, and we wanted to make the most of it. The plan was simple yet exciting. 3 days, 3 different towns, and plenty of hiking in between. The first town we arrived at wasn't much of a town at all. It was more like a scattering of houses and farms, with just a handful of people around. Being off-season, the usual buzz of tourists was missing. This area was known for its main attraction, an abandoned, ancient city from the times of the ancient Greeks. The place had a mysterious charm, like stepping back in time. We had heard of a highly recommended campground from online reviews, so we didn't bother calling ahead. We figured it would be open and welcoming. When we arrived, the gate was wide open. At first, it didn't seem odd, but as we drove in, the silence hit us. The place felt deserted. We called out, knocked on doors, nothing. Through one of the windows, we saw an outdoor bar with expensive bottles of alcohol lined neatly on the shelves and food sitting out on the kitchen table. It was as though someone had just stepped out and would be back any moment. My boyfriend thought it was odd. Why leave everything wide open? But in a small, tight-knit community like this, crime seemed unlikely, so we brushed it off. We decided to check out other campgrounds. The first one we visited was closed, the owner explaining that their grounds were too messy. He recommended another site, but seemed uneasy when we mentioned the first campground. "I wouldn't go there," he said cryptically. When we pressed for a reason, he just shrugged and said, "Just don't. It's not a good idea." That should have been our first warning. The second site he suggested was also closed. Frustrated, we noticed a signboard for the first campground with a phone number. We called it, and a man answered. He explained that he and his wife, who ran the place, were out for a few hours but would return in the evening. He told us to set up camp and assured us we'd meet later. The campground was secluded but undeniably beautiful. With the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze and the occasional chirp of birds, it felt like the perfect retreat. We pitched our tent, left our belongings, and set off to explore the area. After a long, satisfying day of hiking and soaking in the sights, we returned around 10 p.m. It was pitch dark. The campground was still eerily empty. My boyfriend called the owners again, and the man casually informed us they wouldn't be coming back that night. He instructed us to leave the payment under a table mat by the bar and assured us that the kitchen and bathrooms were open for use. The unease started to creep in. Why would they leave everything, an open bar, expensive alcohol, and even their property completely unattended? My boyfriend was visibly unsettled. As we walked to our tent, his uneasiness grew. He kept glancing over his shoulder, scanning the dark expanse around us. Finally, he turned to me. "Let's pack up and leave," he said, his voice firm. I didn't argue. If he felt this strongly, there was no point in staying. I started folding the tent while he held the flashlight, though he kept moving the beam to scan the surroundings. His restlessness was contagious. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow cast by the faint moonlight made my heart race. At one point, he snapped, "Hurry up!" I could hear the tension in his voice. Finally, we stuffed everything into our bags and made our way toward the main road. The darkness felt oppressive, and the silence was deafening. It wasn't until we were halfway back to town that he spoke. "There's something I need to tell you," he began hesitantly. "What is it?" I asked, already dreading his answer. He paused, then said, "I saw someone back there, twice, by the cabins and the bathrooms." I stopped in my tracks. "What?" "I didn't want to say anything earlier," he continued, "but I saw a person. They were standing there just watching." A chill ran down my spine. I tried to rationalize it. It could have been an animal. This is a farm area, maybe a stray dog or a cat. He shook his head. "No, it was a person. Walking like a person. Standing like a person." The hair on my arms stood on end. I felt exposed, vulnerable, as though a pair of unseen eyes were still following us. We quickened our pace, practically running by the time we saw the faint glow of the town lights. When we reached the small inn where we had eaten dinner earlier, we booked a room immediately. Locking the door behind us, we double-checked it, ensuring we were safe. Even now, as I recount this, I get chills. I trust my boyfriend. He's not the type to imagine things or scare easily. I don't know who or what was out there in that dark, desolate campground. And honestly, I don't want to know. Sometimes it's better not to dig too deep into the unknown.
It was supposed to be a typical camping trip with my scout troop. Nothing too fancy, just some hiking, campfire songs, and good stories. For weeks, my friends Davey, Kevin, and I had been buzzing with excitement. We'd planned everything down to the last detail, especially for the annual Scary Story contest. Winning that was our goal this year. The destination, Grayson Falls, a sprawling state park famous for its crystal-clear lakes, winding trails, and caves with whispers of mystery. Even as the bus rolled into the Starfall campground, I could feel the air shift. There was something about this place, an unspoken history in its ancient trees and the rustle of the underbrush. It was alive, in a way that made your skin prickle. Scoutmaster Larry gave the usual pep talk about rules and safety as we unloaded. My friends and I barely listened. We were too focused on grabbing the best campsite. By some miracle, we snagged a spot right on the edge of the woods, away from the main group. It felt like our own private slice of adventure. While Kevin and I set up our tents, Davey disappeared. That was typical Davey. Always restless, always wandering. When he finally came back, his grin told us he'd been up to something. "Guys, forget this spot," he said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "I found the perfect place. It's deeper in the woods. No adults, no rules. Just us." Kevin looked uneasy. Scoutmaster Larry said we need to stay close to the group. Davey rolled his eyes. "Come on, Kev. When are we ever going to get a chance like this again? Real camping. Just the three of us. What's the worst that could happen?" I hesitated, but the lure of adventure was too strong. Kevin eventually gave in too, though not without a warning. "If we get caught, it's on you, Davey." That evening after dinner, we waited for the right moment to slip away. The campfire was blazing, and the other scouts were too caught up in songs and marshmallows to notice us sneaking off. With Davey leading the way, we plunged into the forest, leaving the safety of the campground behind. The woods were different at night. The cheerful chirping of birds had vanished, replaced by a symphony of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. Davey had brought a flashlight, but its beam felt pitiful against the vast darkness. Kevin stayed close, his nervous energy palpable. "It's not far," Davey whispered, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. When we reached the clearing, I had to admit it was perfect. A small fire pit suggested other campers had been here before, but the place felt untouched, almost sacred. Trees encircled the area like silent sentinels, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the stars. The air was cooler here, and the silence felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. We quickly set up our tents and lit a small fire. For a while, it felt like we'd made the right call. We laughed, told stories, and roasted the last of our marshmallows. But as the night deepened, the forest grew louder. The animal calls seemed closer, more insistent. And stranger still, they all sounded eerily similar. The same tone, the same rhythm, over and over. "That's weird," Kevin muttered, his eyes darting toward the trees. "It's just animals," Davey said, though he didn't sound convinced. We agreed to sleep in shifts, just to be safe. Davey took the first watch while Kevin and I crawled into the tent. Sleep didn't come easily. The forest outside felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. I woke to the sound of voices. At first, I thought it was Scoutmaster Larry calling our names. Then I heard other voices, familiar ones. Scouts from the campground. Even Kevin's voice was among them. Though he was still beside me, fast asleep. The voices were too clear, too loud, and each one repeated our names in the exact same tone, over and over. "Davey," I whispered, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" He nodded, his face pale. "Stay inside, don't make a sound." Kevin woke up, panicked. "We need to go to them," he said, his voice shaking. "They're looking for us." "No," Davey hissed. "Something's wrong." But Kevin couldn't take it. He bolted from the tent, disappearing into the darkness. I shouted after him, but it was no use. His voice joined the others, calling out in that same unnatural tone. Davey and I sat in the tent, paralyzed with fear. The voices grew louder, circling the clearing. Then the tent walls began to press inward, as if unseen hands were trying to get in. Shadows loomed, their shapes distorted and unnatural. A figure unzipped the tent, its skeletal face glowing with an eerie light. I screamed as it reached for me, its hollow eyes locking onto mine. The last thing I remember is its bony hand brushing my arm. When I woke, it was morning. I was back at the main campground, lying near the remnants of the campfire. Kevin and Davy were gone. The other scouts acted as if nothing had happened. But the forest felt different, its secrets buried once more. To this day, I hear those voices in my dreams, calling my name in that haunting mechanical tone.
Last summer, my fiancé and I decided to go camping in Arkansas. We were both looking forward to unplugging for a while, just soaking in nature, grilling some food, and enjoying the peace of the outdoors. It was one of those warm evenings, the kind where the air feels thick with the smell of pine and barbecue smoke. We'd set up our tent earlier in the day and were just starting to grill dinner when something unexpected shattered the calm. A man's voice cut through the air, yelling for help. It wasn't a casual, "Hey, can you give me a hand" kind of shout. It was urgent, frantic. My stomach immediately sank. You know that feeling when your heart skips a beat and you just know something's wrong? That's what it felt like. I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward the sound, leaving my fiancé calling after me to wait. When I reached the campsite a few spots down, the beam of my flashlight landed on a man standing in what looked like a puddle of dark liquid. At first, I couldn't tell what it was, but as I got closer, the smell hit me, metallic and sharp. Blood. The guy was swaying slightly, clearly drunk, and his leg was a mess. He dropped his knife, and it had sliced right into an artery near his ankle. Blood was spurting out with every beat of his heart, pooling around his foot like a horror movie scene. For a second, I just froze. My brain was trying to process what I was looking at. Thankfully, my fiancé wasn't far behind me. He's always been the calmer one in these kinds of situations. Without missing a beat, he grabbed a towel from the guy's table, wrapped it tightly around the wound, and propped the guy's leg up on a cooler. Meanwhile, I ran back to our campsite to grab my phone and call for help. But when I tried to dial 911, my heart sank even more. No service, not even one bar. We were in the middle of nowhere, and the nearest hospital was at least 20 miles away. I had a decision to make, and fast. "Let's take him ourselves," I said, already running back toward the injured man. My fiancé didn't hesitate. We helped him hobble over to his truck. Well, more like we carried him, and got him into the passenger seat. He was pale, sweating, and starting to mumble. Now let me tell you something about me. I'm not great with blood. I can barely handle a paper cut without feeling lightheaded. But in that moment, it was like adrenaline took over. I slid into the driver's seat, and we took off. The road to the hospital felt like it stretched on forever, even though I was going way over the speed limit. Every bump and curve made me more anxious. The man kept slipping in and out of consciousness, muttering things I couldn't understand. At one point, I glanced over and saw his hand gripping the door handle so tightly, his knuckles were white, but his eyes were half closed. "Stay with me," I kept saying, even though I wasn't sure he could hear me. We reached the hospital in what felt like the longest, shortest 12 minutes of my life. As I pulled up to the ER, I honked the horn like crazy. Nurses and doctors rushed out with a stretcher, and as they opened the passenger door, blood spilled out onto the pavement. The sight of it made my stomach churn, but I couldn't look away. They whisked him inside, and I just sat there in the driver's seat for a moment, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the steering wheel to steady them. Eventually, my fiancé arrived to pick me up, and we headed back to the campsite. The whole drive back, neither of us said much. We were both just trying to process what had happened. When we got there, we realized the man had left his dog behind. It was a big, scruffy mutt with sad eyes, and it seemed just as shaken up as we were. We fed it some of our dinner and tried to settle back into the evening, but it was hard to shake the image of all that blood. Around 10:30 that night, the man showed up at our campsite. He was walking gingerly, his ankle wrapped in thick bandages. He told us he'd needed 18 stitches, and that the doctor had said if we hadn't been there or if we'd waited for an ambulance, he probably wouldn't have made it. Hearing that sent chills down my spine. It was horrifying to think how close he'd come to dying, but at the same time, it felt surreal to know we'd saved his life. We didn't sleep much that night. The adrenaline was still wearing off, and every little sound outside the tent had us on edge. But as the sun rose the next morning, painting the forest in shades of gold, I felt a strange sense of peace. Life can be unpredictable, and sometimes you're thrust into situations you're not prepared for. But in those moments, you find out what you're capable of. That trip wasn't the peaceful getaway we'd planned, but it turned into a story we'll never forget. A reminder of how fragile life is and how a split-second decision can make all the difference.